Halloween is just around the corner, and my Guy Fieri costume is coming together quite nicely. And I got to thinking, would there be a more appropriate time for me to pick five tabletop games to accompany you on these spooky fall nights? Betrayal at the House on the Hill. It is the quintessential scary horror tabletop game for me. Each player heads into an extremely haunted house and attempts to get better equipment, and I mean, it's an exploration game where you're exploring this haunted house, but there's a number of bits that are really fun about this. The first is the house changes every time you play, because as you explore, you're also building the house. Your character, your little piece, when they explore, will step off of the board onto blank space, essentially the table. You grab a tile from a stack and you flip it, and something may happen, something most likely is going to happen, but you are building the house as you explore it, which means it's never going to be the same any two times that you play this. And so you run into any number of horror tropes. You've got spooky things that you run into, cool artifacts that you find, hauntings, and just a bunch of terrible things that are a lot of fun. But as I said, that's really only half the fun, because at some point during the game, someone's going to fail a haunt roll. And when that happens, the game entirely changes. One person, or multiple, or sometimes none, becomes the traitor. The traitor has to leave the room. They get a separate rulebook that tells them exactly what they need to do, while the survivors have their own rulebook. And what happens could be any of 50 different haunts, 101 haunts if you get the expansion. My second pick isn't so spooky as it is, it's theme appropriate and it's a lot of fun. The Quacks of Quadlinburg, an extremely popular game from last year where players are attempting to build the best potions to get themselves points. It's more or less a push your luck game where you are pulling tiles and holding on just as long as you can. Each player has a cauldron in front of them, a player board that's shaped like a cauldron, and you're throwing rat tails into it. You're throwing all kinds of ginger root, or no, it's not ginger, is it? It's mandrake root. So it's this combination of buying specific ingredients, the ones that you think will net you the most points each round, and also just pushing your luck and just making the tough decisions. Do I keep pulling out of the bag? Because if you pull the wrong amount or you pull the wrong mixture, you are going to explode your potion, and while it's not detrimental, you're not going to get the most points that you can, or the most money to buy better ingredients. There's a reason it was so popular last year, and there's a reason that it's still fun now. It's an extremely just tense and just fun, easy game to play, and fits the theme just enough to make this spooky list. My third pick now is Mysterium. Imagine if you were playing Clue, but there was no board, and then one of the players was also the person that had been killed, and also everyone's working together on the same team. For the lack of similarities that there actually is, I'm still going to compare it to Clue, because one player in this game is trying to get everyone else to guess the murder weapon, the murder suspect, and the murder location, much like Clue, except that everybody has their own individual set of these. And while you work together, the one person that has been killed, the ghost, can't communicate except through a deck of abstract cards, abstract art cards that will sometimes make absolutely no sense. So every phase, the ghost hands out a card with a picture on it to each player to try to get them to guess their specific person, place, or thing. If the ghost can manage to do this by the end of 7 rounds, a final round is played, and the players either win together or they lose together. The engrossing nature comes from having a player as the ghost. They can't speak, isn't supposed to have facial expression, isn't supposed to communicate at all beyond simply handing out these cards. And as someone that's played as the ghost a number of times, it is not nearly as boring as it sounds. It's incredibly frustrating in the best, most fun sort of way. And it's a game that will have everyone clamoring to try that role while working together, and makes for just a really fun, atmospheric, spooky game that I would definitely add to this list. Fair warning, I don't normally talk a lot about RPGs, but we're going to dive into the last two here are indeed RPG games. And what I mean by that is they're tabletop role-playing games, much like Dungeons & Dragons. And while I would recommend you eventually trying something like Dungeons & Dragons, Shadowrun, or Call of Cthulhu, some of those bigger systems, the two here definitely feel more like board games than any of those three. First and foremost, they can be played in an evening. They can be played in about 2 hours, and they're made for one-shot adventures. They're not something that you play over the course of months, that you have to keep rescheduling things. These are games that are sort of one and done. You can get to the table, and they really do feel a lot like board games and are a fantastic introduction into the wide world of role-playing games. The first game is Dredd, and not Judge Dredd, D-R-E-D-D, it's D-R-E-A-D, like Dread, fear, something you're afraid of. Again, it's a spooky list, so they're horror games. But Dredd, the way it works, instead of having big, long, complicated character sheets where you're matching stats, The GM, the person running the game, hands out personality tests, and they're just questions. You know, what school did you go to? What are you afraid of? What vegetable do you like least? It could really be anything. It changes depending on who runs the game, and there's pre-generated ones, or you can make up your own. But it's a list of defining characteristics to help people flesh out the characters that they're playing. And both of these are collaborative storytelling games where one person is running the game and has the reins to the story proper, and everyone else plays a specific role in that, one specific character. As the game goes on in Dredd and the story is laid out, the characters can start saying what they want to do. We played a werewolf one where people would investigate specific things, run from a werewolf, attempt to fight a werewolf with a special weapon that they found. But anytime that a player wants to do something, the GM can call for a check. And what that means is they have to use, and not dice, this is where Dredd really gets interesting. Instead of using dice, it uses a Jenga tower in the center of the table. So when a check is made, when the player is trying to do something that is either difficult or dangerous, the GM calls for a check, and they pull a block from the Jenga tower. Not that scary at first. As the game gets going and the consequences become more and more dire and more blocks are pulled, that tower becomes a little more precarious. And if that tower falls on your turn, your character dies. They are written out of the story. They are killed by whatever is pursuing them. The tower is built back up and play continues. And so with that atmosphere, with the story being spooky in and of itself, add the tension of a constantly precarious tower becoming weaker and weaker every time you decide to make a hard decision, a decision that you have to make. Now, if you can make it to the end of the storyline without having that tower topple, then essentially you'll be able to defeat that monster or monsters or whatever the story happens to be. 2 hours or less, fantastic introduction into RPGs. Dredd is a great game for this time of year, but not as good as 10 Candles. Currently my favorite one-shot RPG to run. 10 Candles is called such because it's played by the light of 10 candles. Again, simplified player sheets. Instead of having statistics that you have to roll dice for, everyone has a number of index cards that they write vice, virtue, a brink, something that will find them hope, just different attributes that they stack on top of each other. And the way that these are used is when a player fails a roll, they can burn whatever card is on the top of their stack. Literally, physically burn. Light on fire, toss into a bowl in the center of the table. This, more than any of the other ones, is a collaborative storytelling game. And it takes a little more vulnerability and silliness, and it's not a funny game. It's not a silly, happy-go-lucky, funny game. But it is engrossing, and it's one that you can easily lose yourself in for a couple of hours, in the best possible way. And some of the stuff is going to seem incredibly dumb, but boy is it poignant if you let it be. Each time someone fails a roll, the scene ends and you blow out one of the candles. And players only have as many dice as there are candles lit on the table, which means that each round, the candles, which means that as the candles darken and the game gets closer to the conclusion, players are rolling fewer and fewer until that final candle's the only one left. And as you sit in the darkness, you basically play until every character has died. This is a game that players need to go into knowing that they will die. Their character is done for. They start this game doomed. But how can you find hope in that bleak world? Essentially, every scenario is somewhat the same in that the world is dark, there's some monster out there hunting people, and it's afraid of light. Those are the bare bones that you know for the game. And you can set it in space, you can set it on a cruise line, you can set it in a city where generators are failing and darkness is prevailing. And your group of survivors is desperately trying to find hope, whatever that looks like for your specific game. And the part that seems the silliest always ends up being the biggest punch by the end. Everybody takes the GM's phone or whoever's running the game, if you've got a recorder or something, and they record, before anything starts, a final message that their character leaves to the world. It seems like the dumbest thing in the world. Until you're sitting in pitch darkness, because the last candle's been blown out, everybody's died, and the GM presses play on that recorder, and you hear the final message recorded 2 hours ago, in character voices of everyone at the table. It is spooky beyond all get out, it is fun, it is completely engrossing. So there you have it, my 5 suggestions to play on a spooky Halloween night. If you've played any of these, or you think something would have been better left off the list or put on the list, I would love to hear your comments. Thank you for watching.